Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me again. I am Sean Crawley, and I am excited to come to your YouTube channel or whatever. I hope everyone is doing well. I hope everyone is weathering the COVID-19 storm with as much joy and happiness and levity as possible. It's a very deeply uncertain time. Um, we live in uncertain times. We have always lived in uncertain times, but it feels like a kind of heightened uncertainness, a heightened uncertainty. And because things feel uncertain in a kind of exponential, compacted way, because of the kind of governance that is at least a part of the United States, the governance seems to not know or care about the masses. Things seem really kind of heightened, it seems to me. So I hope more than anything that you all are doing well, that you are eating whatever you want to eat, whether that be snacks or salads, um, whether that be cake and ice cream, as I've been eating a lot of, or if that's, your keto or Atkins diet, whatever. I hope that you are eating what you want to eat. I hope you are getting some rest. It's kind of difficult to rest in heightened anxieties and things of that nature, but I hope you are getting some rest. I hope you are connecting with the people that you love and telling them that you love them, telling them that you really appreciate them. I live alone, and so it's been very difficult living alone and um, sort of trying to practice as much as possible social isolation. I go to a trail about 5 times a week and walk the trail, and I see a couple of people, but we don't, touch each other. Definitely, I don't know them, and it's kind of just like a wave and hello, and then you keep going. And so it's been difficult for a person like me who is introverted and enjoys time alone, but also enjoys spending like deep time with friends and not being able to see people, not being able to touch people, has been really kind of, I've been feeling the weight of it in my body. And that part has been really difficult. Talking to my parents and talking to my brother and talking to friends and FaceTiming people and Zooming people. These are ways to connect with folks, but I'm also a really kind of touch oriented and space sharing oriented person with people that I love. And so it's been difficult to not be able to share space with folks. And so I know that that's kind of the kind of person that I am. And and so trying to figure out other ways to connect has been something that I've been constantly sort of working through and thinking about. Haven't found a resolution yet, but I'm still actively trying to find something. And so all that to say that it's not an easy time for me, and it doesn't have to be an easy time for you either. These are uncertain and difficult times, and I think that one of the things we can do is to be honest, right? To be as honest as possible about the ways that we feel. Because if we're not honest about the ways that we feel, it seems that, class doesn't matter. Seems your grades don't matter. I think that, and I said this last time I came to you via YouTube, I care more about you and your well being than I care about grading and rubrics. It just seems like to be putting the pressure on the wrong thing to be caring about grades and rubrics. Um, I do have a couple of things that I want to talk about briefly, and then we can discuss it in sort of our open lecture tomorrow. Again, the open lecture is more space for us to share how we're feeling. Mostly, I want to hear from you, and then we can talk a little bit about the readings, which were very short, and we can talk about the things that I'm talking about in this video today. Um, and we can talk about the video from last week too about imagination and fear if you feel like it. And so just think of these as ongoing conversations that will loop back into one another and fold into one another and unfold constantly too. Um, so yeah, I want to return to a reading that we had sort of from the beginning of the semester That was Vincent Harding, when he said, quote, "What is the vocation of the Black scholar? What is my vocation as a Black scholar? We avoid the question American style only at the risk of our soul, which is at once the same as and more than our soul." End quote. He talks about avoiding the question, right? And the avoidance of the question he calls an American thing. I have this long book that's called Black Pentecostal Breath: The Aesthetics of Possibility. It's a 320-page meditation on sort of practices of Black Pentecostals. It was a book that allowed me to really think about the practices of people in a sort of marginalized Black Christian community, and how the practices that were marginalized initially are practices that people kind of imagine the Black church to be in general. So like in popular culture, whenever you see depictions of Black churches, it's typically through the idea that all Black churches act in the ways that Black folks act in Pentecostal churches. And so it's interesting to me how the marginalized community becomes the model through which we understand what Black church in general is supposed to do and be, right? But in this long 320-page book, one of the things I talked about is this concept, or this word, aversion. To have an aversion for something, to think that something is something that you have to avert or avoid. And I think about the concept of aversion a lot, because I think that what sort of the practice of Western modes of cognition for what race and racism are the practices of averting the actual material fact of the people that are in front of you. I like to talk about this Enlightenment philosopher named Immanuel Kant a lot, because he is sort of my go-to example of what it means to have an aversion for things, because he talks about in one of his manuscripts, Immanuel Kant talks about the Enlightenment concept, and he was supposed to answer, it was like a contest sort of, where philosophers wrote in to answer the question, what is enlightenment? And Immanuel Kant said in his response, enlightenment is man's escape from self-incurred minority. And that is a really flowery way to say that enlightenment is man's ability to think by himself on his own. And that in order to achieve full enlightened thought, you have to think on your own, that you are a thinker, you are a scholar based on or predicated upon the idea that you have thought by yourself. And this is the antithesis of something that Vincent Harding is saying about what the purpose and the role of the Black scholar is. Vincent Harding is saying that the purpose and role of the Black scholar is to recognize themselves as functioning through soul, which is not just the soul of the individual, but a soul of the collective. And so for the Black scholar, in the way that Vincent Harding is describing it, in the way that I think about it, the Black scholar is the one that recognizes that they are part of a whole, that they are a member of community, that they are part of a social body, and that the work that the Black scholar is supposed to do is constantly in the service of the social organization from which they emerge, the social organization that makes them actually possible. Whereas Immanuel Kant is just like, enlightenment is my capacity to be an individual thinker. I'm smart on my own, right? This is interesting to me because the way that Immanuel Kant talks about Black people, I'm sure I've said this to you all in class before, but the way he talks about Black people is by having an aversion for thinking on his own, right? He says, for example, when he's talking about sort of the skin of Black folks and Black folks being dumb, he says that the intelligent, or the capacity for intelligence of Black folks, this is a deep paraphrase, but the capacity for intelligence, the capacity for cognitive sort of fitness and rightness for Black people is deeply impaired, and we know that it's impaired. Why? Because we can see through their skin color that Black folks lack the capacity for intellectual rigor and thought, right? And he doesn't come up with this idea on his own. He uses other people that have encountered black folks because he hasn't. And so he has to read the reports of other folks in order to come up with his very idea of what black people look like, what black people are, in order to make his cognitive leap, or his imaginative leap, really, in order to say, we know that black people are not intelligent. Look at their skin color. He talks about what other folks say about black folks. And so it's like, this is really interesting to me, that enlightenment thought is your ability to think on your own. And yet, when you come to think about black folks, you have to actually enter into something like a social mode of thinking in order to think about what black people are. Black people are fundamentally social, and he could not even escape the fact of that, and thought is fundamentally social, such that he had to use a social mode of thinking in order to even come up with his imaginatively ridiculous understanding of what it meant to be a black person. So it's not to say that his imagination for what black people are is correct. It's only to say that what he imagined black folks to be was only made possible. His thought, his cognition was only made possible by doing the very thing he said was an impossibility for enlightenment thought. He had to enter into a kind of social mode of thinking in order to think the very capacity of black people. So what I think is that Immanuel Kant never actually thought about black folks on his own, right? So that he has an aversion for what black people are. He has an aversion for, or avoids the very fact, the material reality of black folks, in order to enter into a social mode of understanding what blackness is. The social understanding of what blackness is something that is supposed to be escaped. It's a condition that you are supposed to not desire. It's a condition that you are supposed to think of as fundamentally flawed. And so he enters into what the social zone has already said blackness is, what blackness should be, and he corroborates that social understanding of blackness, but it's a deeply white supremacist socialist understanding of what black people and what blackness is supposed to be. That's a long way to say aversion is a problem that we have to contend with, and that what Vincent Harding is saying is that we avoid, or we avert the question of what is my role as a black scholar at our own peril. We avoid the question insofar as we begin to participate in and mirror the practice of white supremacist capitalist heteropatriarchy, right? Such that the questions that we pose are deeply important, not just because, you want to be mean-spirited, or not just because you want to wow people with your capacity for asking deep intellectual questions. The purpose of questions is literally to interrupt the concept of kind of smooth, ongoing ideas, thoughts, imaginations that have become normative in our world. And so Vincent Harding is telling us that the purpose of the black scholar, one of the purposes of the black scholar, is to ask questions, right? That there have been things, there have been ideas that have been allowed to be accepted without interrogation, and that the role of the black scholar is to say, no. We're going to ask some questions here. We're going to interrupt your capacity for the normative understanding of what it means to be black, what it means to be woman, what it means to be sex, what it means to be racialized, what it means to have sexual orientation, what it means to be a part of a nation. We're going to interrupt this normative concept with the question, right? And so for me, I'm constantly searching for the kinds of questions that will be really generative for us to really interrupt who we think we are, who we think we should be, and how we think we should be in relation to one another. Because if you don't ask the right kinds of questions, you don't have the right kinds of answers. And quantum physics says this too, but because I'm being recorded and I don't want to get it totally imprecise, I'm not going to say it. But quantum physicists also understand something like the kinds of things you are looking for are the things that you are going to find. And so if you don't ask the right kinds of questions, you will not find the answers towards the things that you are deeply looking for. And there's something fundamentally flawed in our world that we have to address. And it seems to me that one of the ways we can do that is to begin to pose questions to one another. And so one of the things I want to encourage us to do is to think about what kinds of questions do we want to ask about, for example, this pandemic that we are currently experiencing that is asking us to be socially isolated as a form of protection, as a form of care, when as individual practices of and in individual practices of care, when we have a kind of governmental structure that doesn't seem to want to practice the kind of care that they are then offloading onto the individual. It's not that I think we should all go to supermarkets and clubs and churches and dance, but I do want to ask the question, why is it that all of the onus is put on the individual to withdraw from the social world, and the government is not doing its sort of role in terms of testing? It's not doing its role in terms of vaccination, right? That there are questions that we need to at least ask about who can we look to that can be a part of coming up with solutions for this pandemic that we're experiencing. Um, so, what are the questions that we want to ask? The question, what is the vocation of the Black scholar and what is my vocation as a Black scholar? And refusing to avoid or refusing to avert the question, but reckoning with the question, it seems to me that you should ask of me, you should ask of all your faculty, even if they ain't Black. That what you should be doing is asking, what is the purpose of the, especially now, when there seems to be so much worry over how am I going to be graded? I think we should be at least asking, what is the purpose? What is the point of education? What is the purpose? What is the point of learning? Is it only so you can get a good grade, right? Is it only so you can get a good job? Or for me, is it about how are we going to live in this particular world and do justice and practice mercy and practice joy with one another? Because that seems to be more urgent than the question of, well, what's my grade going to be at the end of the semester? What is your vocation? What are you trying to do in this world? Are you trying to be a part of the status quo? Or are you trying to disrupt the normative order? Are you trying to live freely? Are you trying to practice liberation? And are you trying to breathe? And I didn't know when I sort of started writing the book, Black Pentecostal Breath, The Aesthetics of Possibility, the urgency with which breathing would take in my own life. But breathing is like really, really important. And it's something that we don't notice that we do until it gets interrupted somehow. And that one of the deep worries about this pandemic is the way that it's communicable through breathing. Like, we are afraid to be in space with other people, just breathing the same air with them, because the virus can be transmitted through our breathing practice. And so, like, when I ask the question, what kind of world do you want to live in? What kind of person do you want to be? How do you want to breathe? It's not an abstract question at all. It's really a question of how are we going to breathe in this world, doing justice to one another, recognizing the sort of dangerous capacities that are constantly having to be reckoned with because of the political economy that chooses profits over people as more important, right? The vocation of the Black scholar, according to Vincent Harding in his reading, is to speak truth to people. It's not to be eloquent. It's not to have great words. It's not to pose great questions, right? The point of the Black scholar, more than anything else, is the attempt towards truth, the attempt towards honesty. And you move towards that attempt in the social world with other people, right? And so what I'm constantly trying to do and trying to think about and trying to wrestle with is how can we speak truthfully to one another? How can we be honest with one another in ways that are not always celebrated? How can we be honest in a way that causes a reckoning, even when we recognize that the reckoning will mean that we have to really, really fundamentally change how we relate to one another? That one of the things COVID-19 is calling on us to do is to recognize, one, how is it that we relate to one another on a daily basis? What do we think about laborers? What do we think about low-wage workers, right? What are the ways that we think about low-skilled work, right? And how do we, on a daily basis, before the eruption of this pandemic, how have we invisibilized lots of labor and the people that produce that labor such that we can have luxuries like home delivery of food, that we can have 2-day delivery of books, right? How is it that we have invisibilized or not considered practices of labor and the laborer who is producing the labor? And do we want that kind of world? Or does COVID-19 at least compel us again? It ain't the first time, but this is another occasion, an otherwise occasion to rethink the same thing that we've been trying to think about for a very long time. How are we going to do justice with one another? How are we going to care, right? And so the truth that I want to speak is that you are wonderful, that you're beautiful, that you're intelligent beyond measure, and that the normative world is not here to accommodate or celebrate this lovingness or this livingness of blackness. It's not. That the world, as it is currently constructed, is anti-black, right? It's anti-indigenous. It's queer antagonistic. It's femphobic. It hates a whole bunch of people. And all the people that it hates and the intersections of the ways that that happens is itself because it does not cherish the practice of and the fact of difference, right? And so one of the truths that we have to speak is a truth that doesn't seem to register as truth. People be like, oh, it's opinion. No, to me, this is truth, that you are wonderful, that the practice of Black life, that the practice of Indigenous life, the practice of brown life, the practice of queer life is itself the practice of the wonderful. It's the practice of the beautiful. It's the practice of the joyous. And it's the practice of this kind of life against a world that says that not only should it not be wonderful and beautiful and joyous, but also we are going to attack you for the fact that you might think of your life in the kind of way that you might want to celebrate it, right? And so for me, the first truth that we have to speak as Black scholars is, we have to reorient the thing that we think of as the beautiful. I think of beauty as not like the antithesis of the thing we call ugly, because that would be like a kind of binary logic that is grounded in sort of white Western supremacist understandings of the beautiful. And I'm thinking of a beauty that is beyond occasion, a beauty that is not grounded in like the fact of how you appear to the world, your phenotype, your nose, the structure of your body. I'm talking about being beautiful because you breathe, because you exist. That's a different understanding of what it means to be or to become constantly beautiful, right? Beauty as practice, not as thing that you can own, right? Beauty as a way that you posture yourself in the world, right? Beauty as the way that you want to be with other folks. That's what I think of as the beautiful. And so I want to think about Black life as beautiful life because it's about a practice of relationality, a deep generosity, a deep care for the world and how we exist with one another. And so what are the conditions under which COVID-19 is spreading? And what can African American studies and what can the Black scholar do to address how the virus is spreading and the meaning of the virus in our social world? Because viruses have meanings. And I think if we pay attention to the way the current president, I always try not to say his name because I think he's a terrible person, but the way the current president talks about COVID-19 by racializing it and using a nation as the sort of centering logic for the way he talks about it is a xenophobic practice. Because what he's trying to do is racialize and nationalize a virus at the same time that he's trying to produce a kind of patriotism towards and for the United States. And the question that we have to ask is, well, why is he doing that? What is the purpose? What is this in the service of? Like, who does it help? Who does it hurt when we call these things by a certain kind of nation and a certain kind of racial logic, right? How are we practicing harm against people based on the ways we think about what a virus, which is deeply borderless, it doesn't have borders, it doesn't adhere to sort of the concept of the nation, it travels, right? And so, what is the purpose then of this sort of racializing logic for viruses that this person is using is something that we have to ask. And it's something that I, as a Black scholar, think is one of the most urgent questions that we have to ask. Because this is not the first time that we have racialized or gendered or classed or sexualized a specific virus in order to say, well, this is the community that has it. And so we don't have to care about it or for the people who are who contract the virus, because that's the kind of person we don't have to care about, right? HIV and AIDS, a lot of people are saying don't make comparisons. Some people are saying make comparisons. You can make a comparison with anything. That's what I think. The only thing I would say is that the comparison that I would make is that HIV and AIDS is a particular kind of virus that in its initial moments was, people thought about it as targeting a specific community. And so not racializing it, but certainly saying this is the property, this is the private property of a particular kind of community. And because we do not care for that community, we will allow whatever that virus does to that community to happen. And we will justify it. And we will say, well, that's God's punishment for being gay, right? And so we have to be concerned about the ways we racialize and class and gender and give orientation to, like, even things like viruses, because it's not sort of distinct from the social world in which we live, but it's deeply a part of it. It's an imbrication of our social world, right? That who we are, what we think of as biological processes, are not sort of irrespective of the social world, but we think of biological process as a part of the social world. That's how it is. And so we have to think about, what is the meaning of the virus in the social world? Because the care that we will then offer is about, what the meaning that the virus takes, right? I asked us to read a piece called "Is This What Sociology Is For?" And it's not because I'm a sociologist, I am not. But it's because I wanted us to think alongside the reading to question what is Black Studies for, what is the purpose of the Black scholar. And so I want to read a couple of things that I have written that can hopefully give some sort of grounding to what I think we should be doing, what we should be engaging, and the ways what we engage should be about the world. And so one thing I've written is that Black studies, Black queer theory, women and gender studies, indigenous studies, decolonial studies, in different ways, are not simply academic disciplines and modes of thought for academia. These are areas of exploration that are about saving ourselves from the violence of Western modes of thinking relation, desire, the borders of race, gender, nation, and affection. That these are modes of exploration that are about saving ourselves from the violence of Western modes of thinking relation, desire, the borders of race, gender, nation, and affection, and other borders too. Black studies is one iteration of a disruption to the way knowledge itself is presumed to be produced. And Black studies, like women and gender studies, like decolonial studies, like indigenous studies, like queer studies, is supposed to disrupt the way we think and desire and behave, not abstractly, but in the actual world. Me and you and I, all of us, right? The things we do and practice in the university are not for the university. They aren't things that are just for your transcripts and for faculty. They aren't just supposed to be appendages to thought and things that we add to our CVs or to, our works cited in books and things that we add to our syllabi. These various modalities of thought are supposed to compel us to rethink our relation to land, to property, to the ways race, gender, sexual orientation are normative strivings, and as normative strivings are the products of white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. These various disciplines are about unsettling what appear to be settled concepts, including desire. We have to stop clinging to disciplines as modes of academic thought in order to refuse the work of that knowledge working on and fundamentally transforming me, you, and us. Again, we have to stop clinging to disciplines as modes of academic thought because we cling to them in order to refuse the work of that knowledge working on and fundamentally transforming us. We have to stop acting like it's just for academia. And we have to start asking, how are these things about the transformation of me in relation to you and the world? What is at stake is not abstractions of thought for university journals, but wrestling with how to be ethical and kind and caring to one another. Black folks are disproportionately vulnerable to negative practices of the healthcare and medical industries. Our outcomes are deeply influenced by racist practices of the institutions as well as professionals that do not believe we are in pain, and do not believe or even care about our bodies, and that don't believe that we care as Black folks about our bodies or our communities. Such that the way Black folks are considered generally is the way we are imagined by these institutions and these industries. One example that I use is Michael Brown's murderer, Darren Wilson, when he said Michael Brown looked like he was a monster and looked like he was bulking up, right, to attack him. It's important to consider because in his mind, he created an image of what Michael Brown was not and responded, however, to the thing that was in his mind. He didn't respond to the thing. He's engaging in, again, like Immanuel Kant, he's engaging in a kind of aversive logic. I'm not going to contend with the thing that's in front of me. I'm going to contend with the thing that I've imagined you to be, and I'm going to respond to the thing that I've imagined you to be. And I'm going to produce violence against the thing that I've imagined you to be, right? So it's that the ways we imagine are not like neutral, right? They are dangerous if we do not have an accounting for the ways we've imagined other kinds of people, other kinds of ways of existence. So it's that we have to imagine deeply from a practice of care and justice and a desire for the flourishing of all life. If you imagine from the space of care, justice, and the flourishing for all life, then you are imagining from a different place than the imagination from white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, right? And what Darren Wilson needs to do and what the normative world needs to do is reorient the space from which imagination is being practiced. This is why we go to Black thought, because Black thought itself is imaginative, but it imagines itself from the place of care, justice, and a desire for life's flourishing. That's what it is. So the interview that I had you all read with George Benderman about health outcomes for Black folks and COVID-19 make me want to ask these questions. What is the image of Black folks generally? And how does the image of Black folks influence the kinds of care Black people will receive, right? And if we think about working class jobs that are considered to be essential labor, but are also deeply racialized practices of work. So we're thinking about home health aides. We're thinking about ride-sharing drivers. We're thinking about service workers. We're thinking about people that work at grocery stores. Thinking about people that do sort of janitorial work, right? These kinds of work that necessitate a lot of face-to-face contact during a pandemic that calls for social isolation. How can we think of the status of work and workers, of labor and laborers, if we are not taking into account these other modalities that intersect with the concept of work and worker, labor and laborer? And how can Black studies actually inform us to actually ask other kinds of questions about this labor and the laborers who are producing the labor? In 2014, I published an essay titled Otherwise Ferguson. I say the following: to begin with the otherwise as word, as concept, is to presume that whatever we have is not all that is possible. Otherwise, It is a concept of internal difference, internal multiplicity. The otherwise is the disbelief in what is current and a movement towards and an affirmation of imagining other modes of social organization, other ways for us to be with each other. Otherwise, as plentitude. Otherwise is the enunciation and concept of irreducible possibility, irreducible capacity to create change, to be something else, to explore, to imagine, to live fully, freely, vibrantly. Otherwise, Ferguson. Otherwise, Gaza. Otherwise, Detroit. Otherwise, worlds. Otherwise expresses an unrest and discontent, a seeking to conceive dreams that allow us to wake up laughing, tears of joy in our eyes, dreams that have us saying, I hope this comes true. And there's another book titled Joyful Militancy by Nick Montgomery and Carla Bergman that asks the following: how are people carving out relationships based in trust, love, and responsibility amid the violence that permeates daily life? What sustains these worlds? What makes them thrive? And so I'll close by saying, otherwise, possibility is the fact that alternatives exist already. They don't have to come to us from the future. They are not always or primarily utopian alternatives, even though they might be that too. Otherwise, possibilities are the practices of the marginalized, practices of the non-normative, practices of those that have been excluded from the concept of the normal. Otherwise, possibility is the practice of asking the question. What is the question? Well, the question is plentiful. The question is plentitude. But the question is always in the service of disrupting the concept of the normative and its violence. Black studies is the practice of otherwise possibility. So, our question that we will talk about: how can we think with this concept, with this idea of otherwise possibility, when considering how to address COVID-19 and its aftermath? We will never go back to normal, and we shouldn't desire to go back to normal after this, right? And so if we're not going to go back to normal, and if we refuse the concept of the normative, how can otherwise possibility, how can the idea of the alternative give us a way to imagine other kinds of ways to be with one another in ways that practice curiosity, joy, justice, love, equity, care? That's all I have for you. Thank you for joining me, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.